All right, so we're gonna
Oh,
get started here. Have a bit of a conversation here with Andy, and like I want folks to chime in, jump in, ask questions, and this is really informal. It's a chat. I didn't come prepared with any like specific questions. I just want to hear Andy riff. Uh, he's like, please don't listen to me riff. But if you don't know, Andy Bell, really talented front end web developer, designer, and he's the founder of Piccoli, an agency that is just highly influential in the community. If you haven't, run into his blog, I'm sure you will in the next couple days because those links get passed around like crazy. And Andy these days is really focused on what he's calling like scalable CSS. How do we write code that isn't just good for today and now, but how do we like allow it the room to like grow and to grow with us, as our sites mature and our interfaces mature, components mature, that sort of stuff. So I just want to get the conversation started by just saying like, Andy, can you like just introduce yourself a little bit? I know I gave you a bit of an introduction, but I forgot something,
it's the worst
but
part
I
of
want
this.
people just to
Yeah,
hear from you.
I can't stand talking about myself.
I'm right there with you.
Well, I'm Andy. Like Jeff said, I run a little design studio called Set Studio, and along with that, run Piccadilly, which is like slowly evolving into a publisher. Um, Not to compete with Smashing, something on this channel, but yeah, that's the game really. But yeah, the CSS thing. I think we all know I like CSS, and what I'm doing at the moment is looking at, like Jeff says, how you can make things work in the longer term, but all of the soft skills and core skills that come with that actually are the root of a good CSS code base, rather than I can write code better than you, etc. It's all about communicating and planning, unfortunately. So that's what I'm looking at the moment.
That's fantastic, Andy. And one of the things I know that is, like, a topic on your blog that's been coming up is getting back to the basics of CSS in terms of like,
Yeah.
how do we relearn some of these things that are fundamental to, the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. But maybe, we have a better or like a different understanding of them now with modern CSS and sort of the intrinsic types of things that they are inherently able to do. Like what sort of, basics are we talking about? Like how far back are we going as far as like relearning, or are we even relearning some of this stuff?
It depends. So, like, I approach the Cascade, and the word I can't say because I'm from Yorkshire, specificity, very differently. So than most. So I don't run completely true to the spec. More like I come up with a model for using it effectively. So I wrote about that on the blog recently, where if you follow that rule of thumb, you shouldn't really find yourself in many problems with them. And it's the same with inheritance as well. I think a lot of people like approach these things with fear, and it's actually not scary anymore. It was scary once upon a time. I think the landscape's changed for a lot of people, but and the browsers are no longer evil. They're actually quite useful than what they were once upon a time. So I think people think cascade and specificity is hard, but it's not. If you just keep it really simple, so it's like reminding people of those things, and by approaching your CSS like a top-down global setup, you actually write a lot less. And if you approach your CSS with confidence rather than fear as well, and like it not quite a defensive setup, but more like how can this go wrong? Like, how can this component break? Like instead of building it and going, yep, that's cool, looks good. It's like right now I need to try and break it in as many ways as possible, and then it's setting those rules and guards up to stop it from breaking in those ways. Before you know it, you've got really simple code base and really scalable code base as well that goes with it.
Now, you mentioned fear with the cascade and specificity.
Mm.
What is one way you try to eliminate fear, from someone who's already scared about it? Because, there are a lot of moving pieces to it. How do you, like make it seem
Normally, I
approachable?
have
So,
disconnected your AirPods.
One
oh,
second. Oh, I can't. Hey Sharon, can you please mute? I'm sorry, I can't
You sit
mute
down.
you. Thanks, dude. Anyway,
Well,
back to
oh
that.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. So someone who's already scared of those concepts. I can't keep saying the word because I can't say it, but you all know what I'm saying. The S word. Specificity. There you go.
Yeah, what is that? Yeah, yeah.
It's the
What is
accent, man.
specificity?
Yeah. I think the thing is, right, like, so that, for example, that one's a really simple one. There's a scoring system that you can use for it. And you work right to left with the scoring system, and basically if there's more numbers left, you're in trouble. But if there's low numbers on the right, you should be fine. And it's like, do you really need to write complex selectors? So do you need to write, for example, you're targeting a paragraph element that's like 5 or 6 nodes deep. Do you need to target it with that node order, or can you not add something lower specificity, like a class, which then sets you back to having a selector that's easily overridable? So it's writing CSS with intent is probably a good way to describe it. So because we've got a junior at our agency, so we train them up from scratch. So they've never written a line of code before they joined. And the way that we get them to remember when they're writing the CSS is think about the selector. So what you're actually selected before you even start writing any CSS is you start writing a checklist. What can be globalized? What is specific to this component? What is specific to this page potentially, if that's the case? Tends to not be how we do things, but think of all the things that are very specific about that particular element that you're dealing with, and before you know it, you've written yourself various selectors to tackle it from various places. So instead of trying to do all your CSS in one place, it's like, right, there's a global style here that's not going to affect anything, so we can make that, and then we can make this adjustment to the component, and we can do this, that, and the other. So it's distributing less CSS across a wider surface area. And if you
Yeah.
embrace those things, if you embrace the cascade, especially, and you embrace things like custom properties, which allow you to add these like default values, everything becomes really, really flexible really quickly. And those core concepts aren't scary anymore because you're writing everything with such low levels of like specificity. But it's not a problem. It's the same with Z index. Like, if you keep it low, it's easy. And if you remember what stacking context is, which is a reasonably difficult concept, but I guess that's the point I'm making, is like learn the way things actually work, and writing CSS becomes much, much easier. And I appreciate it's hard too, because specs are really tough to read. I certainly can't understand them very well. So I guess there needs to be some content to do that stuff for people. Yeah.
You mean like a blog like Piccalilli, right?
Oh, well, potentially.
That's
Frantically
awesome.
writing notes. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, one
Yeah.
of the things I know I struggle with when it comes to like writing CSS, like on a full project, is
Mm.
when to drop like elements as selectors, let's say, and go into classes or going into more specific
Mm.
styles. Because when we talk about global styles and inheritance, at what point is there a good happy medium where there's a good balance where we say, okay, now we go into like naming things, or do we try to stay as semantic as possible?
So I am all about classes personally. I think there's certain exceptions, right? So let's say, for example, you've got a card component, because that's what we talk about in this industry is cards. You've got one thing you've got for sure in a card is an image, right? So that feels like it's safe to select, or even maybe a picture, but it's safe to select the element there. But then you've probably got a heading in a card. Now, you might be tempted to think, well, yeah, heading's fine. I can select those styles. But what happens if it's a H2, or what happens if it's a H3 or H4, depending on what it is? So that, to me, is where you start to think, is there multiple outcomes here? And if there is, then he's a class, because the class is flexible, and it can be applied to any of the elements. And then document the nuts out of it as well, to make sure that people are using it correctly. Like, if a pattern library design system, tell people exactly how to use the component. So it's like, yeah, make sure you get the heading level correct. Apply this class, it'll apply to any heading level, it's fine. So it's making those decisions like, how can this again go back to it? How can it break? And breaking it also includes different HTML as well. So yeah, styling elements is really useful when you're writing global CSS, but when you come into like component styles, it does make sense to start thinking about using classes because you're only going one step up the specificity score then as well. So it's keeping things nice and low still and nice and flat. It's why I quite liked BEM for a long time because it kept everything super flat. Um, and yeah, I think that's probably a good approach, really.
Huh. Well, you mentioned BEM, and I love that too. I'm all about the naming and how that helps avoid styling conflicts.
Mm,
You had a model as well that that is still like widely used, and I see it
mm.
cited often, which is Cube CSS.
Yeah, yeah.
Can you explain how that syntax is similar, if not different, than BEM, and how like the two or how yeah, basically just how the two differ.
So the reason why I started exploring Cube um, over BEM, like I used BEM for a lot of years and a lot of different types of projects. So like before I was running an agency, I was like a CSS consultant. So I got exposed to a lot of things you wouldn't want to see, and also like different complexity levels in projects as well. And BEM seemed to just work beautifully well. But when it came to things, so I came in and worked on a really like highly stateful front end, lots of state changes, lots of reactivity. And what I found with BEM was because the modifiers were classes also, you were in a position where you couldn't trust the state of the front end because you had to trust the rigidity of the JavaScript, which is not a sentence that is true in life because JavaScript is, we all know what it's like. I know it's better now, but you can't trust that it's going to give you that finite state, especially when it could possibly add in multiple classes to an element at any given time. So the the first port was I started looking at exceptions, which is like using data attributes instead, because you can only ever have one value for a data attribute. So if you needed to make a quick state change, then you could guarantee that that would be, the state change that you expected. So that started that, and then me and Hayden did every layout together, and that's like 5 years ago now, nearly. And that to me was like when we were talking about it, we were like, we're writing layout compositions. These are layout compositions, and then it was like, okay, well, that's another layer in this methodology that's cooking. We've got a composition layer, we've got skeletal layouts, and we've got the exceptions. And then I started using utility classes more, and it was like, okay, that's another layer. And then it's like, okay, I need a word for components now that makes it all come together into a nice, easy to remember 4-letter word. So I called them blocks, and that's it. Because BEM already calls them blocks, and I thought, well, I'm already using BEM, and I like the syntax of BEM. I like the double underscores for elements, and so it just felt like a natural, like a riff, I guess, on that methodology, but loosening it up a little bit, and then also tightening it up where you needed it to be tightened. So like the exceptions instead of modifiers. And yeah, it worked. It worked a treat
You've got some
so
every
far.
layouts fans in the chat there, which is pretty cool to
Oh,
see.
thank you very much. Yeah. It's I can't
uh,
believe how long it's been. We've since we published it. So yeah, it's probably literally 5 years almost to the day. I think it's probably about a month away. That is. Should probably, me and Head should probably do something about that, really. Um, in a different
you
manner.
put it
Yeah,
out there now. It
I
just
just
gets to live in the wild.
all I need to do is just say that one sentence to Hayden, and the magic will happen from there. Let his creative brain take over. Yeah, I'm sure he'll find a way.
One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately is just some of the things that beginners like struggle to learn early on in CSS. And there's a lot of pressure in CSS
Mm,
because there's a lot happening right now, right?
yeah,
And it seems like there's even splinters, in terms of how people are writing CSS. We
mm,
have like different types of scope, or we have some ways of like just BEM, or another type of like
yeah,
syntax, or we have web components now, and different ways of how we scope our styles and keep specificity low and prevent those types of styling conflicts. What do beginners, like need to know right now if they're stepping into CSS for the first time?
So I think the first thing a beginner needs to know is to run your own race to start with. So don't look at other code base and say, man, that's how I need to write my stuff. Right, a good example is Cascade layers, right? I haven't used Cascade layers yet, so like it's identifying what CSS capabilities are and whether they're actually useful to you, or it's like, oh, cool, I want to try this thing out. And that's how I get overwhelmed. So I mean, we used to give this advice to people back in the day with JavaScript, right? When all the frameworks competing with each other, and people were like, "What do I learn? What do I learn?" It's like, pick, learn the fundamentals as much as you can, and then picking each JavaScript framework will become easier. And I guess the same goes for CSS, right? Go right back to the basics. Try and learn the core elements first. Try and understand how CSS actually works, and get into the mental model of, okay, I don't have as much control as I thought I did, but I'm going to embrace that rather than fight against it. And then, yeah, pick and choose the capabilities that interest you in CSS. Learn layout, I think, really quick, as quick as you can. Try and learn the difference between flex and grid and what they're capable of. And then, yeah, pick the cool shit and learn that. Yeah. Animate something as quick as you can. I think that makes it
Oh
interesting for
gosh.
people as well. Yeah.
It totally does. Yeah. Then
Yeah.
then then you start bending your mind around keyframes and figure out
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
wait, what am I doing here? Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Um, you know, um, with the cascades specifically, you mentioned cascade layers and how you haven't
Mm,
used them yet. And yeah,
mm,
like there are some features that I don't even find myself reaching for it, but I
mm,
haven't written them off as like oh, this is a useless type thing. I'm starting to see that CSS is releasing just a bunch of different tools, and what we have now is a big tool set.
yeah.
And now there's much more of a focus on choosing the right tool for the job as opposed
Hmm.
to let's go for what that snippet is. What's
Yeah.
the right tool for this particular job that's going to keep, to your point, my components defensive in a sense, or like future proof or scalable,
Mm.
and how can I keep it maintainable against everything else that's happening. So how did like is CSS just like too hard to learn for some people because we have all these tools now, or are there certain tools that to like learn first? I'm just, curious how you might approach, you know,
It's
um
so hard because I've been doing it for so long. So I can't like really, but like put myself in those shoes. And it's something I really struggled with our junior as well. Like didn't realize how easy we had it in the old days. And like everyone's like, oh yeah, but browsers are rubbish and all that. But it was so easy because just everything was simpler. Like web design was simpler because we had the limitations of the browser. Like the capabilities of what websites did were nothing compared to what they do now, and there's not nowhere near as much surface area to touch as what you have to touch now as well. So to answer your question, like it does feel like there's too much CSS to learn at the moment. But I think one way to look at it is like, what am I interested in? Like, what excites me about front end? So this is one thing I've been trying to get our junior into. It's like find something that makes you really excited about working on it, and that it's like more like a hobby than work, and then just run at that as fast as you can and as hard as you can until you run out of steam. And then by like running down that road and getting really good at one thing, you learn how to learn, you learn how you learn, because everyone learns differently to each other. And then you can pick off bits of the CSS stuff that actually interests you as well, like aside. So say like, right, I'm really into animation, so I'm going to learn animation. And then you might come out of that and be like, right, what did I struggle with animation? Well, I use a lot of position relative and stuff like that, and moving things top left right. So why don't I learn how Translate works, 3D transforms, trying to like refine my skill set. And then yeah, I had a few layout problems. So now I'm going to learn about Flexbox, and then you just keep adding to your toolbar. What's that Avengers bad guy called who adds all the things to his glove? Like it's like that. He just
well,
specializes
I'm
in
sure
these certain
someone's
areas.
gonna. Sure,
Please,
someone's
someone,
gonna
yeah, rescue me.
pop it in
Yeah,
there, or else it's gonna be in the back of your mind all day. Like, what is
yeah.
that thing?
Yeah, that's it. It's like CSS now is big enough to be able to specialize in certain aspects of it. Like I'm awful at making things look nice in CSS. Like even though I'm a designer by trade, like I don't have that ability to get that spit and polish. But then our design engineer in the studio is the opposite. It's like everything they touch is gold, you know. But then when it comes to like layout work and strategy and planning, that's what I'm good at. But then they're good at doing all the other bits that make everything look incredible. So you put us both together, and then you got a team. So it's like identifying what your strengths are, and then running at it, and not, you know. I still look at, you know, like I look at Jay's Twitter feed, and I'm like, man, this guy's just too talented. But then, you know, it is what it is. He's just good at that stuff, you know, and then I'm good at other stuff. So yeah, I guess that's it really. Be easy on yourself and specialize in what you're actually good at. There'll be a
Yeah,
place
and
for you.
that's
Yeah.
just the fact that the web is so big is something I
Mm,
like to remind folks about as well. Just the fact that there's room
mm,
for everybody in it, and it's
mm,
easy enough to like let's remove barriers and let more people in because there's
mhm.
plenty of room in there. And that even means with our disciplines too, right? Because the web isn't just well, like you said, back in the day, it was like, okay, which web font do we use? It's like Verdana
Yeah,
or Helvetica, like here we go. Uh, um, or hey, let's make an image for that heading, even better.
yeah. Look,
um,
the only good web font is Georgia from back in the day, and I still use it as
I
body copy
still
now.
use that one.
Yeah,
It
nothing.
in fact, I was using it just yesterday.
Yeah,
If I'm being honest.
we're
Yeah,
redesigning Piccadilly in the studio, and there's one requirement from me, and that is that the body copy has to remain as Georgia. You can do anything else. You can use whatever display fonts you like, but the body copy has to remain because it has been since day one, so it has to stay the way that way.
it's now just like part of your DNA, right? It just has to
Yeah,
stay that
well,
way.
nothing reads better than Georgia. Yeah.
Uh, Down in the chat, Frank has a sentiment in there. I think a lot of us feel, which is feels tough these
Hmm.
days to specialize in an economy that desires full stack developers. Right?
Ain't
Like,
that the
what do you think
truth?
about that? Because there's a
Yeah.
generalist view there, but the specialization is what really drives our abilities, right? So
Yeah. I
yeah,
think it depends on what phase in your career you are as well for that. So like I think if you're a beginner, you got to prepare yourself to spread yourself like thin to get into the job market. And dare I say it, you've just got to chase whatever the hot like technologies are at the time to get your foot in the door. Like so my first job, so I started as a freelancer, but then my first real job was for an agency. The tech stack was .NET Web Forms. I was a Flash specialist and and Creative Suite specialist. Have I used any of those in the last 15 years? I have not. So like, don't get hung up on like, oh no, I shouldn't be learning React because it might not be here. Yeah, it probably won't be here. You're quite right, but it honestly doesn't matter. Like, you need to get paid, and then like this goes back to what I was saying about CSS. Like, find what you're actually interested in, and then slowly but surely skill yourself up and be patient with yourself. Like, first sort of half a decade is, you're going to be running job to job. You're going to be, especially in the market where it is now, a lot of layoffs happening. Like, you got to just be prepared to be quite agile, I guess. And then your specialism will start to shine through, and then you'll find companies that are looking for that specific type of individual. So I've noticed a lot of companies have gone from just hiring front end developers to like hiring specific like design engineers or UI developers or UX developers because front end's looking crap. So they want people that are going to specialize in certain skill sets. So find what you're actually good at over time and also never settle on that as well. So I'm in the lucky position where I do feel like I'm somewhere now with that, but also I'm not going to sit on it forever. Like I might specialize in something else in the future because the longer you're in this game, the more boring it gets as well. So it's I might just find myself wanting to try something different at some point.
Yeah, and it sounds to me like then you're describing full stack as something that might be experience based more than like something
Yeah,
that
role
you
based.
just jump
Yeah.
jump into. Like there's a track for it, right?
Mm. I mean, there's boot camps, I guess, and they will train you out as a very hireable person, right? And I don't think that's the worst thing and or the worst approach to going into this industry. I think the problem with the industry now is there's no space for actual beginners anymore. Like there's a minimum experience required a lot of the time. I don't think a lot of companies are that bothered about training people up. So I think like boot camps are going to be one of the main options to get into the industry, especially if you want to work in like the West Coast American tech scene. But what that would do is it would give you the full stack skill set that could get you into a job. And then I guess yeah, from there it's really hard because I'm a rectangle colorer that knows how to code. I learned CSS out of spite, not because I wanted to. I learned it because people kept messing my designs up. So I learned CSS so I could build them myself. Um, and that was that. So like I come at it from such a weird angle than a lot of other people like who are sort of associated as developers. Like I am very much a sort of designer that learned how to code. So my knowledge of the full stack spectrum is thinner than a rolling paper, if I'm honest. I know just about enough to be dangerous, and that's about it, really.
Well, you're so known for your CSS work and thoughts and
Mm.
just influence in general. Like, at what point then did CSS come from become or transform from a spiteful thing to something that you end up loving?
I think, do you know what? It took a few years for me to actually enjoy CSS. So like I learned CSS and HTML, but I still very much preferred Flash at the time because Flash I could design something in Illustrator, copy all the vectors, paste it into Flash, and then make it look good quite quickly. Whereas it was a real chore to learn to make things look good with CSS. But then when CSS3 came around, got native border radiuses, we got shadows, we got gradients. It became easier to do things with CSS to make things look good without having to spend hours slicing out gradients from Photoshop and stuff like that, cut corners out. So yeah, as CSS got better, it became easier and it became more appealing to people like me because like, oh cool, we can actually just finesse this in the browser and cut out all of the rubbish of designing in Photoshop.
You just
So I guess that's
gave me a
yeah.
flashback of, like,
Yeah.
the border radius tool in Photoshop. I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I had that on, like, shortcut commands, to get
Yeah.
those nice rounded corners." Like,
Unbelievable.
total
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, but I'm sorry, I just
No, but it was
interrupted you there.
horrendous. It was just such a hacky way of doing things. But I guess as well, we were also trying to like recreate print design in the web at the time as well. Like we hadn't quite worked out that the web is its own medium. So and designers, we didn't have any specialism in web design. We just like, oh, I've designed a brochure yesterday and now I'm designing a website. So it's the same thing. But yeah, I guess like as things got easier with the more technology, then I started to get more interested in it, and then I've gone beyond how can I make things look good to oh man, I need to think about how to make things actually work better because I'm finding myself writing the same stuff over and over again, and yeah, that's sort of sent me down a rabbit hole that I haven't managed to get out of yet. Still climbing down it. Yeah.
So the love story is not done with CSS yet, is
Oh
what you're
no,
saying.
no. Don't think I'm
It's an
good at
ongoing
now.
story.
Yeah, it's the problem. I'm not a good designer anymore because I don't do it anymore. So out of practice. So now I've got to do CSS. So I've got nothing left.
If Bob here in the chat has a really great topic that I think I
Mm.
think anyone that like you should just have great thoughts on in general, which is like, can you discuss accessibility in general and your approach to it? How do you like plan that as part of your as your strategy for maintaining scalable CSS?
So I've got I think that one of the principles I run at to start with, like I've got it on my wall here. So cross. I'll take a picture of it if someone reminds me. And it says no aria is better than bad aria. And it's instead of looking at accessibility of I need to throw as many attributes at my markup as I possibly can to make things accessible. It's like it's the same thing I teach about CSS is go back to the root of what you're trying to do. So say for example, you're building email sign up form, for example, it's thinking about right, opening VoiceOver up, writing some HTML to start with, and then saying how does everything get announced, and then if you're not using the correct semantic elements, you're not going to get the right announcements off the bat. So you might not be able to write the correct semantic. I don't know why you wouldn't be able to, but say you can't, then it's at that point that's when you start to look at like ARIA roles and trying to fake it, as it were. But I think the main thing is it's not just about thinking about, oh, I need to make this work for screen readers. It's how can I simplify this design element or this design set of components? How can I simplify it so it works really well for the lowest common denominator? And then at that point, you're going to make your life a lot easier to make things accessible. So, for example, like tooltips, you don't need to use tooltips. They're a nightmare for keyboard users. They're a nightmare for screen readers. And generally, a tooltip's like a sentence. So look into typography and type scales and contrast, and you can find a way of integrating that micro copy that's in the tooltip into the and surfacing it into the design instead. So I think if anyone's looking at like I need to get better accessibility, you can learn the WCAG specification for sure. But what you can also do is think about simplifying design elements as much as possible, and you're probably going to have more success doing that. If I'm honest. And get your
Yeah,
color contrast
yeah.
right as well. I mean, color contrast is one of like the most common things that people trip up on. You get that right, you get your type scaling correctly, you get get those basics in place, and you're probably producing a better experience than the vast majority of people already are. So don't stress
Yeah,
about it too much, I
absolutely.
guess. Yeah.
Oh,
And
geez.
listen when
And
someone picks you up on something as well. That's the one thing that a lot of people don't do is like if an accessibility consultant or expert picks you up on something, learn from it and actually implement, what they're telling you to do as well.
well, what I like about
Mhm.
what you're saying is that it really, dovetails nicely with the discussion about full stack and specialization
Mhm.
in general, because yeah, like you to every, what hammer, problems are just nails, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And if we are, like one person trying to cover all ground, well, we may not have the best view of that particular problem. And
Mhm.
sometimes stepping back and recognizing the problem is not something that CSS needs to solve, but maybe strategy needs to solve instead.
Yeah.
That's a good pointer, a good reminder. Have you ever
Mhm.
had times where you've had to facilitate that kind of like communication in an organization where someone might want to take all matters in their own hands, but perhaps there's someone else better suited to take that task because of their specialty?
Oh yeah, I run an agency, Jeff. I have this conversation with clients like on an almost daily basis. I think that's one of the thing I do the most is wrestle control from clients now. Put it where it needs to be with the people that are actually hired to do the work for them. So yeah, and you have to approach it differently for every person as well, I'm afraid. Yeah, I think it's one of the things that core skills is learning. Like we make people do this discovery process, and the reason why is yeah, we do a lot of planning, we do all the research, but really it's me working out their clients and working out what they're all about, because they can start off really nice and friendly and helpful, but as you do like a process that runs over a period of time, you really start to see how they respond to certain situations, and then that's how you build the way of communicating. And it's the same with team members as well. Like, think of if you work in a company now, how many of your team members are identical to each other? Like, none of them. Like, I mean, I've got three people that work at my place, and all three of them are completely unique in the way that I have to deal with them. So it's actually like embracing that and learning that and finding that most effective way of communicating. Generally, it's just being nice to people and listen to them, and then that goes a hell of a long way. That does, like, really listen. Don't wait for your turn to speak. Listen to what they're telling you, and then respond to that. Yeah.
That sounds pretty hard to me. I don't know. Listening, paying
Yeah,
attention, waiting. No, no, no. Let's just bulldoze and just get it done, right? Ship it.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Run straight through that wall. Yeah.
I'm also interested just in. Oh, well, hold on. We just got a big question in there, so
Oh
I
man,
I wanna actually look at that one first
it's
before
a
I ask
big
my
one.
little piddly question. Let's see. Carl says, I'm working in a team of 12 developers as the UI designer, UI developer. We agreed on creating an in-house CSS framework based on Cube. Nice.
Nice.
The hardest part now for the developers is when to use what composition in utility classes. It is very hard to have all devs on the same line or to onboard juniors fluently. Mostly when doubt, the advice is ask Carl. I know that feeling, but this way, like I can not die peacefully. Any tips on onboarding, educating? We want you to die peacefully, Carl.
Yeah, please. If there's anything we can take away from today's session is we need to make sure Carl dies peacefully.
Dies peacefully.
Well, they started to change dying peacefully into winning the lotto, so the lottery, so he can go on an island. That's more positive, they thought. But I
I'd
would
say
say
so.
I should die peacefully without needing my expertise in this. I think Cube is very useful,
Mm,
extremely useful in what we do. We but that's a problem when you build your own CSS framework. There's no um, big amount of documentation or like Tailwind. You can find it all online. When we
mm,
have we set up our own documentation center, but it's always outdated. So that's the problem. And for juniors, it's quite hard to start because of the Q principle. The composition
mm.
classes is quite new. You have to explain everything over and over and over again. And as a designer, I knew I designed with the cube in the back of my head. I see
Mm.
all stacks and clusters and whatever, uh, but it's hard to bring it over.
So I think the one thing I picked up on there is that the documentation's always out of date, which is like the first part of call for people, like self-discovery. I think one way of dealing with this, so you got this problem where developers don't know which composition to use or which utility class to use. Every time you build a layout on a project or on a site, create a lowest simplest version of that in the code pen and then link it in the documentation and then to the layout that you've actually used each time. So you're almost like a sub pattern library in your layout system. So we have the composition stuff documented in, like, it demonstrates what each layout does, similar to every layout. But then one really useful way to do that, if people still ain't getting it, if you build a navigation, you stick that in the cluster, or if you build like a 50/50 layer, you stick that in the switcher, and etc etc etc, and you keep adding and adding to it, and having this policy internally of, if you add something, you need to add documentation to go with that or update existing documentation to support it. You make that part of the process. Carl gets to die peacefully / win the lotto because it's the self-discovery aspect of it. Developers would be happier that they don't have to keep asking questions like
Yeah.
all right, I'm building this pattern, let's go and see what the layouts can do. And a lot of the time the core layouts might not do the job, but then that is when they can come and speak to you and have a conversation about it. And it's more, you're not being pecked with all the other questions about layouts. You've
Yeah.
actually got time and energy to deal with it then and think it through with them.
The documentation is the key.
100%. Sorry to say it. It is very boring, this documentation, but it's also really useful as well.
No. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, okay.
Mm.
I'm building components, as in a pattern library with clusters as a component. Or I don't know, navigation, or you have a drawer with things.
I think that lots of demos helps
Okay.
make things very clear to everyone. I think everyone can understand a demo. Yeah.
Okay.
Hey, speaking of uh, of documentation and consistency and teaching all that stuff. Nicholas down in the chat says, "Hey, how does Set Studio working on the W3C design system fit
Oh,
into
I
all
wish we
this?"
did. No, we did
Yeah.
the web dev one before they threw it in the bin in favor of whatever internal crap they're using at the moment. But yeah, the W3C one uses Cube, I think, though, maybe, or every layout, or one of the combination of the two. But um, I don't really understand the question there, though. Oh, is in the documentation that they have in their system. So is that what you're saying, Nicholas? Here we go. Oh, I see. Yeah. So it's all
Yeah.
about that documentation level, isn't it?
Yeah. And
Uh,
the other month we were having a conversation with like Brad and Dan and Ben and other folks about design systems. And specifically, a lot of people want to talk about the global design system, or global components or a global component library of sorts. Um, how do you see that fitting in, with the future of like, learning the basics and understanding how things work on the web?
I mean, it's a heavy one, Jeff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I want you to answer it fully too.
God, I don't know. Do you know what? Like, I have this weird sort of mixed thing with design systems. And I really appreciate design systems, and I work with design systems for years. And like almost every project that we do will have a light pattern library at least to go with it. But I think it's really bloody difficult for people to learn in that environment because unless you know what you're looking for in a design system, which we've learned with clients, like unless you really signpost where things are going to be and how they're going to use these things, design systems are so overwhelming for someone to cut. I mean, I think this W3C one's actually a good example of that because when you land on it, you land on a sort of prose content, it's a wall of text, right? And I think if you land on there and you've not very highly skilled, you've not been doing this very long, it's like how do you even know where to look, right? You don't know what to search for yet. You don't know what to think, how to ask the right questions, stuff like that. So I'm not sure that the design system world is as beginner friendly as it could be. But then is it it's quite a specialized skill as well. Is design system work? So yeah, maybe don't start in the design system world with my advice. Build cool websites instead. You know,
Oh, just build
yeah,
cool websites. I mean, that's what it
just
comes
try
down
out.
to at the end of the day,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Should we all chant just build websites?
Well, that's not the right show. Yeah,
Oh yeah, whoops. That's a great show.
yeah,
Gosh, one other thing I want to talk about just because, we don't I mean, lots of people getting into the business. I think there's this sense of like what they want to do. They want to own their own future oftentimes and run a
yeah.
studio just like you do. The whole like practical end of this, like how do we get to a place where you can actually run a business, and what sort of things did you have to consider getting into this, and what sort of like can you give us like a little peek behind the curtain of what happens over at Set Studio?
I'll give you a really little one, a little peek. I think the main thing, if you want to start a business, get a good accountant, is my always immediate advice to anyone to get a really good accountant because then you don't have to understand business because you just get your accountant to do it all for you. So that's the main thing. Like I'm not a smart person, so like I couldn't learn all of that stuff. So I think the main thing I'd as well is like get an accountant and learn to let go of things. So like I started, so the Set Studio it was like my freelancing consultancy, and that was the hardest thing was learning to let go of things and trust that people are going to do things right, and you don't have to be involved in every single thing. I think it's where a lot of tech CEOs actually fall down at the moment. They try and get their paws into every single thing and just mess things up. So it's like learning that as well, and charge more money than you're comfortable charging for things because then you're charging the right amount. And I think that's another tip as well, really. But other than that, run your own race because it's all different for everyone. and I'm certainly not someone to give actual business advice. That's for sure.
Well, how about this? You know,
Yeah.
in talking with about scalability in general, how do you decide to scale from a solo person to a two-person team, let's say?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So I was at a crossroads before I set the studio up. Um, like I was getting quite bored of what I was doing, just having the same discussions with clients over and over again, doing CSS stuff, basically just doing the same project over and over again, just with a different logo on it. So I thought I'm finding myself burning a little bit here. So one thing I've always worked in client services, like almost exclusively. I did a little stint as a product designer, but really it's always been in agencies and stuff. And I worked in a lot of bad agencies as well. So the way I decided to scale up really was like, I want to do more exciting projects, but I can't do them on my own because I haven't got the skills for that anymore. So I started bringing in freelancers as like a cooperative. So I was like, right, okay, I'm going to work with this designer for this project, or I'm going to work with this developer and I'll design. And then it got to the point there I thought, well, I'm actually better when I work with a team. So then that's how I just decided, okay, well, I'll hire someone then and then build it up that way. And that's it. So Set Studio in its first year was just actually me. I was Set Studio, but I just had a team of freelancers that dipped in and out of projects. And then it was like, okay, we'll definitely need someone permanent now because the freelancers are expensive, man. And then you just sort of grow naturally. I think one thing to think about with hiring people is like, don't, and I've made this mistake, don't put a number of heads as an aspiration. So it's like, I want to have 10 members of staff. It's like every time constantly look at your team and like, well, where's the weakness in our team at the moment? Like, what there's going to be a weakness. Well, actually identify that weakness and then hire specifically for that role each time, rather than saying I need 3 developers. Like, what are my current developers good at? In our case, our developers are really good at front end, but if you throw any back end into the mix, stuff gets pretty hairy pretty quick. So it's like, do we hire a back-end developer? Do we have the work for that back-end developer? And will they actually enhance the team? And it's like thinking about that all the time. When the reality for us at the moment is actually, I thought we needed more developers, but what we actually need is an account manager. And that frees up me to do more production work, which is probably better than bringing another developer on and then having to sort of train them up because we're only small at the end of the day. So yeah, constantly reevaluate things. Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that because I mean that seems like to be the $1 million question for lots of people trying to make that transition is like, when do you do it? How do you know when? And then is it the right move? Because there's a set, like, there's a bit of discomfort there, stepping out
Oh,
of
it's terrifying.
your comfort zone.
Yeah, it's really scary.
Uh,
Yeah, paying
and
people
did you lose
salaries
lots
is
of sleep over that?
I don't think I slept at all last year. I think I slept less when I hired full-time staff than when we had babies. So yeah, it's super stressful. I wasn't prepared for how terrifying it is having salaried employees, but yeah, it also really drives you on to actually like, right, I need to look after these people now and make sure they're
Yeah.
happy. And yeah, it's good. It's nice feeling.
Well, what a different responsibility, right? You're worrying about, like, hey, am I keeping specificity low to, am I taking good care of my people here and are they able
Yeah,
to live good
yeah,
lives?
exactly. Are they happy in general? And that's it. And so making sure they are is now my primary role in the industry, in the business. So yeah, it's a different thing now. And
That's
that's why I
awesome.
started writing about CSS again, because it gives me an excuse to actually write it. Yeah.
We're winding into the last stretch of our hangout here. Is there anything specifically you want to like share with the group here as far as what you're working on, some of the things you're thinking about, some of the like bigger questions that you think that the community should be like struggling with at the moment. I just want to give you like an open invitation to just like I said at the very beginning, riff. Come on, Andy, riff.
Right. I guess I think the thing for me this year, right, is like I'm doing 2 things. I'm in a very lucky position where the agency is running really smooth, and I'm very, very fortunate to be in that position. So I've got a bit more headspace now, and so I thought I need to write a CSS course. I haven't done one. I bet the web dev one doesn't really count, so I need to do a proper CSS course. But I don't want to do a fundamentals course. I want to do like a real life CSS course. So I started looking into that this year, and then that's related to the workshop that I'm then doing at Smashing as well. And then the talk is on the whole theme behind everything is I want to get people better at writing CSS. And it's not a course or workshop or talk about how to write code. It's actually how to communicate with each other effectively and how to plan. And if you do a lot of that upfront work, really heavy planning, lots of communicating, lots of iterating on ideas, the scalable CSS is actually a symptom of that rather than something you're trying to make happen with, okay, coding standards, we're doing this, that, and the other. You're writing simpler CSS because by planning things properly and by iterating on ideas and not just building the first thing you see, you actually end up building a simpler UI in the first place. So the CSS simplifies with it. And that's really the overarching theme is get into the. I am giving away the gist of my workshop for free here. Well, that's it's. I mean, it's becoming a bit of a shtick now for me. Is like I'll do a talk on CSS and people expect to see lots of samples and demos, but it's actually me teaching it in a different way. And like, and at the moment, it's no, you need to talk to each other more because it's something like it's been a really hard thing to do because I've had to do it. So I've got a context site that we build as part of this whole thing, this whole process. But I've had to do it in the traditional waterfall style of designer hands off to developer, which I haven't done for near enough half a decade. But I know that it's really prevalent in the industry, like, and you can see it with like the tools that arrive in like the Figma dev mode. To me, it's like, man, people are actually not talking to each other. Like, if you're having to like abstract all of this information into like the design metadata, like it's really sort of concerning because by building things in a silo and by designing things in a silo, you don't have that collaboration. You don't have someone like sanity checking your design work, right? And you don't have the designer doing the same for your implementation either. So it's building that good relationship with each other, and conflicts get easier, discussions get easier, and then the CSS gets easier to go with it too. So spoiler alert, if you came, we signed up thinking you're writing CSS for 4 days, you're not.
So maybe a code problem or maybe a CSS problem isn't a code problem. It's it's something else. No, that's very true.
Something underneath it, yeah.
There's a human component to it too.
Yeah.
Real quick, we have a couple of final questions here to get your brain going here. Will the workshop project use the boilerplate shared in Piccalilli? That's the first question. So if you all don't know it, Andy does have a workshop coming up here. It's going to be May 9th through 23rd, 2024 at 9 a.m. Pacific time. And yes, Greg is right on the ball right there with the link. Thank you, Greg. And and so, make sure you register for that. But I just want to also make sure that, that you're just aware that that's a thing. And but the boilerplate, is that going to be part of the workshop?
It's underneath the code base that runs the context site, but we're not getting into the boilerplate. It's a lot more abstract than that in terms of CSS, and it's not very cube orientated either. It's a lot more sort of CSS as an author in language in its own right, and learning. So, well, for example, the first session is we're doing fundamentals. So we do pure fundamentals for a whole session, and then getting everyone on the same page as each other. And then it's a variety. So one day I'm setting everyone free in a fig jam and getting everyone to plan stuff. And then another time we're doing live coding. And so like we're not necessarily building it together, but it's learning how that project could progress and actually delivering it well, by not writing as much CSS as you think you need to write in the takeaway. Yeah.
And let's call this our final question, because
Okay.
it's a good advice one in general, which is quickly returning to the topic of documentation. Any tips on which tools to work best?
Oh, I guess documentation tools, you mean stuff like Storybook and
Mhm.
tools like that. Storybook
Yeah.
works really
Are
well.
there
Yeah.
are there different types of tools, for like different types of documentation? Like maybe if you're going to go into like more of a developer focused one, you're going to
Mhm.
have all these, snippets, whatever. If you have more of a design type of thing, like how do we make these two work together?
Um, it's a good question. It's all very specific to specific types of projects. I think like if you're writing documentation for developers, I think one thing that tends to work well for me is being very specific about how to do things, because I'm not very good at writing like that. So I'm quite loose, as you all very well, Jeff, from the number of articles you've edited from me. I'm very loosey goosey, but it's putting that different hat on and saying like specifically what do you need to do to make, say for example, documenting a component. You have to be really specific about what parameters get passed into it and what the return is and like where it can go wrong for developers, so they actually read that documentation. But I guess for like design documentation is on the other side, because what you don't want to do is influence a creative too much. You want to give them space to actually to do what they do. So it's like more hints and tips towards that, about looser copy. But for very technical documentation, yeah, very what's the word? Academic, I guess is the word. Hence why every layout's in Hayden's writing style rather than my writing style, because he's like actually quite an academic person and I'm just, well, me. So and it was, a very complicated layout system. So it's like, yeah, we need to write it in your style, because yeah, it's I guess it's writing for the context that you're working in, and just giving more information than you think you need to give, because then you're giving the right amount of information, for someone who has none of the context that you currently have in your head at the time when you're writing it. And keep the reading age low as well. That's another tip for me with everything. Copy, blog posts, think about making it simple for a kid to understand, and then anyone can read it and understand it then.
Or just
Yeah.
imagine I'm reading it.
Yeah, or me. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Andy, thank you so much for joining us on this chat. Like seriously, you are just a wealth of information and knowledge, and like you just offer such practical tips that we can put into pragmatic use today. And again, remember that Andy has a masterclass workshop coming up on scalable CSS. The link, we'll drop it in again here. But it looks like Jaren is already saying like, hey, there's only a few spots left, so you might want to get your ticket relatively soon. But with that, I just thank everyone for coming here and making this a fun conversation. Thanks for like, posting in the chat and helping us, just like explore these like loose topics and trying to figure out what's new in our disciplines and how we go about them. So anyway, like this was just another smashing hangout here, and just thanks for joining us, y'all. We'll have another one coming up soon, and I really hope to see you there, because you make it all fun for me and for everyone else. So with that, have a great day, and we'll all see you at the next one.
Cheers, everyone. See ya.